Hey again. In this one, we're going to talk more about immunity and what it actually is. So, the first thing is just to understand what our body is constantly fighting. There are different pathogens that we have to deal with all the time. So, I'd like you to have a basic understanding of the pathogens. So, we have viruses, bacteria, fungi, protozoan, multicellular. When we look at the viruses are not alive. That's the first thing. So, viruses usually have DNA or RNA. They have to have a nucleic acid. And what they do is they take over cells. They don't have any organelles. So when they infect our cells, they use our ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum, to make copies of themselves. And then they spread. And then when they leave the cell, they usually kill it. So these are common viral infections. So you're looking at the common cold, which you might know is actually called the rhinovirus, like rhinoceros for the nose, rhino because of the nose. The flu you probably know is called influenza. COVID was a virus, so you can see some common viral infections. There are very few antiviral medications. Most of the time with a virus, our body has to fight it, and our immune system has to basically kill our own body cells to get rid of the virus. Bacteria, though, are single-celled organisms. They're prokaryotic cells, so they can be killed. When we take an antibiotic, that's how we're going to kill bacteria. And these are examples of bacterial infections. So we have what's called streptococcus, staphylococcus. Staph happens a lot on the skin. You've probably heard of strep throat. You've probably heard of TB. Some cases of pneumonia are bacterial. Tetanus is as well. Now, when we're looking at the fungi, these are multicellular organisms, and the ones that mainly affect us are things that are called ringworm, athlete's foot, tinea. This would be a yeast infection. You can have it on your head as well. Athlete's foot, the same thing. Ringworm is not a worm. It's a fungus. It's a yeast infection in the skin. So you take an antifungal medication. The protozoans are little single-celled organisms. A lot of these can get in. There's like a typical one associated with, drinking water when you shouldn't. Malaria is another example. It's a little spore from blood. It travels. The mosquito feeds on the blood and basically transports that spore. And then multicellular are big things like different types of worms that can happen if we don't cook our meat all the way. So when you look at immunity, it's your ability to resist disease, like how you're to fight infections. And there's two things we have to look at. There's the innate immunity, and the innate immunity is the fast one, and it responds the same way no matter what to any pathogen. So when we're looking at a pathogen, the way your immune system recognizes them, and you'll see this shortly, is through things called antigens. So when we talk about non-self, those are things that don't belong to us, and your immune system needs to fight them, versus self, which is the ones that belong to us. The adaptive immunity is specific. So think of the innate like a hand grenade, and the adaptive is the sniper, because the adaptive uses the B cells and the T cells, and that one only goes after one antigen at a time. And notice that one takes longer to kick in. So when we look at immunity, it's helpful sometimes to think about your lines of defense. Your first line of defense is just to keep it out. Don't let it get in to begin with. If it gets in, then you go to your second line of defense. Both the first and second line are examples of what we just said were called the innate immune system, because it fights any non-self pathogen. We sometimes called non-specific. Your acquired or adaptive is the last line of defense. And remember, this takes the longest to kick in, but it's the best because it's actually going to go after that specific antigen and destroy it. So we're going to look at the first line, the second line, and the third line. So when we look at the first line, the very first thing is just keep it out, right? If it doesn't get in to begin with, we don't have to deal with it. So we have these barriers to entry, and there's a whole bunch of these. The first one is technically our skin. As long as your skin is intact, it's keeping everything out. That's why we wear gloves or gowns or masks or goggles, to give an extra layer of defense to protect us. Our skin also has hair all over. Most of the body has hair. And then there's a waterproofing protein called keratin. Now, we do want to have a waterproofing protein because you might know if your skin gets dried out, it can crack. So we don't want to make it too dehydrated and dried out. We also have sweat and oil. So sebaceous glands make oil, and they do several things on our skin. For one thing, they can have an acidic pH. And just having some sort of acidic secretion can decrease the growth of some pathogens. Another thing is that they have different enzymes and proteins that are there to kill bacteria. And one is called lysozyme. And lysozyme is an antibacterial enzyme, and it's found in our sweat and oil, and it helps protect us from bacterial infections. We also have mucous membranes. So mucous membranes, mucus is sticky. It's going to be found anywhere there's an outside opening. So we have a mucous membrane covering our eyes. You might have heard the conjunctiva. We have them in our nose, our mouth, and then on the other end in the urethra, the vagina, and the anus. And so the mucus is sticky, so anything trying to come in through those portals should get stuck in the mucus and not make it in. Well, what if it comes in your mouth and you swallow it? Well, we have hydrochloric acid in our stomach, and that keeps the pH of your stomach around 2. So that will help kill things. And then we have flora. Flora are like the good guys. That's the normal, healthy bacteria, and we have it covering our skin. We have it inside our large intestine, and so our normal flora protects us because that does its own warfare with any of the pathogenic ones, and so it helps kill them so they don't make us sick. Well, what if it gets in? Okay, well now we need a second line of defense. And notice there's several prongs of attack here. So we're going to have some cells, and you probably recognize some of these when you studied blood and you looked at some of the white blood cells. We're going to talk a little bit about some proteins and then some other. So once it gets in, how do we stop it from making us really, really sick? Well, the cells, we're mainly looking at phagocytes. And phagocytes are going to go after things and eat them. And when they eat them, they're going to break them down. So they're going to patrol the body, and they're going to attack and remove anything dangerous. So here's some macrophages. And I don't know if you saw how it followed and then ate the organism, and they surround it, and then they take it in and they eat it. So it's pretty cool how they work. And then we also have, so the monocytes basically form most of the macrophages. They come from monocytes. The neutrophils was another type of macrophage. They really like to eat bacteria. And those eosinophils were another white blood cell. They like to go after big guys like those parasitic worms. We also have cells called natural killer cells that are really kind of wild. So these guys just patrol the body, and as they go on patrol, they're going to be looking at these antigens. So here's some cells here, and these green things, it says MHC1. You don't have to know that, but they're basically going to show what's called the antigen to the NK cell. So what the NK cell does is it goes around and it looks at cells and it's looking at these antigens. And so when you hear this term antigen, I want you to think of it like a cellular ID card. So all cells have antigens, and they let your immune system know which cells belong there and which ones don't. So when the NK cell finds a cell that doesn't belong there, we say it's non-self, it actually shoots chemicals at it. They're called perforins, and you could probably guess if you look at what it's called, perforins, because they perforate. They put holes in the cell membrane and they kill the cell. So they basically just patrol, and they're able to recognize any non-self antigen and then kill that cell. And then basophils are a type of white blood cell. It's also known as a mast cell. And basophils or mast cells are going to release a chemical. You might see these little dots here, and that chemical is something called histamine. Now, histamine has a lot of functions in the body. We will be looking at it as what it does for the inflammatory response. We'll look at that shortly. So we have cells, we have proteins. So these are just proteins that are going to defend us against any kind of non-self pathogen. So complement with a C, if you ever see the letter C with a number, like you see the little C3b, it just means complement. It's a whole bunch of proteins. They come from the liver, and they have several functions in the body. There's 3 functions here I want you to know. So one thing they do, see these little blue dots, these are all the little proteins. When they get released, they can go up to bacteria. Remember, these are single-celled living organisms, and they clump together and form a little hole. It's called a MAC, membrane attack complex. So they put a hole in the cell membrane, and cells can't live if there's a hole. Everything leaks out. So they kill them. They also stimulate inflammation. So they activate those basophils we just looked at to release all that histamine. And they also can neutralize a virus, because the little yellow guys here are the complement and the orange thing is the virus. Remember, a virus wants to take over and infect your own body cells. So what they do is they bind to the virus so it can't infect your cells. Other proteins are called interleukins. We have these things called cytokines. Cytokines kind of a generic word for an immune system protein. So we have interleukins and tumor necrosis factor. You are not learning all this interleukins, so don't freak out when you see this. I just want you to know, if you see the letters IL, it means interleukin. But just notice they do a lot. They affect your B cells, your T cells, phagocytes, fever. So they're very important proteins in our immune system. Tumor necrosis factor does just what it sounds like. It's a protein that kills a tumor cell. We also have things called interferons, and think about them as interfering with the viral replication. Interferons are our body's best defense against a virus. Because remember, a virus takes over the cell. And so when the virus gets inside the cell releases these interferons, and then they go protect the other cells in the area so the virus doesn't spread. They also can trigger inflammation and stimulate your macrophages. And if you see colony stimulating factors, what they do is they can actually go to your bone marrow. Remember, your bone marrow is where all the blood cells are made. And these are factors they can give patients to stimulate specific white blood cells. So maybe you want to increase your neutrophil count or your lymphocyte count. So these are proteins they can give that are basically growth factors to stimulate the production of those white blood cells. Inflammation, it doesn't feel very good, but it's pretty important. So when we look at inflammation, there's 4 classic signs: heat and redness. When you have the inflammatory response, blood vessels are going to open up. They're going to dilate, and those mast cells release histamine. And that's going to increase blood flow to the area, and that's going to make it feel warm, and it's going to look redder in color, or pink. It's going to get swollen. Usually the increase in fluid is going to do that. And then you hurt, you feel pain. And pain is usually due to the swelling, but also there's inflammatory chemicals that are released. So when we're looking at this whole inflammation, you have some sort of tissue damage, that's going to signal to your body, hey, ouch. So now you're going to release histamine, blood vessels get bigger, more blood flows to the area. And so they're going to get leaky and bring blood. And then the idea is that, you should feel a little bit of pain, by the way, because pain is good, right? It tells you to slow down. But it doesn't feel great, but it does have a purpose. So we're bringing a lot of white blood cells there to fight the infection. We're bringing there other, NK cells, proteins, our other innate defenses. It can dilute any toxins that might be there, also remove waste. And the reason it gets warm is that heat actually increases the rate of chemical reactions. So that's really helpful to speed everything up. And then really pain is supposed to signal rest, and so it can heal. There are a few number of people who are actually born without the ability to feel pain, and they usually don't live past the age of 30 because pain actually stops us from doing stupid things, right? Or hurting ourselves even more. Now, if you're having a lot of inflammation, then you might want to take something to back it off or slow it down. So when we generally look at NSAIDs, non-steroid anti-inflammatories, you're not memorizing these pathways here, but there's chemicals called prostaglandins, there's things called leukotrienes, bradykinin, all sorts of chemicals are released, and they can also make the sensation of pain occur. And so sometimes it might be good to take an NSAID to help deal with if there's too much inflammation. These are examples, and you can see some of the things that they do, but the main thing is to help decrease the pain and the inflammation. And notice they also reduce fever, and we'll be looking at that shortly. I just want to mention really quick though that, we have inflammation. The good inflammation is what I'm talking about right now. That's there because you have some sort of injury and you need to deal with it. Sometimes, though, our inflammatory response gets a little out of control. We're supposed to stop it after the initial inflammation and then go back to life. But sometimes it doesn't stop and we get chronic inflammation. And you can see it causes many, many types of diseases are associated with this chronic inflammation. So what do? Well, there's meds you could take, the NSAIDs. Now, these are a little stronger, the steroids, the prednisone. You could get a steroid injection in a highly inflamed joint to settle it down. And you don't have to memorize this list, we know that our diet definitely can help reduce inflammation. We know exercise helps and sleep is critical. So if you have a lot of inflammation, maybe first try to treat it with sleeping and diet and some exercise as well for you. And then the other innate defense is a fever. So, when we have a fever, the idea is your body temperature goes up because the higher temperature will help your immune system work better and fight that fever. Well, your hypothalamus sets your body temperature. And by the way, you might think 98.6 is normal body temp. There's a lot of research now. That was weird. Some other audio was going off. 97.5 seems to be what it is now because the information for 98.6 was decided in the 1800s. But what happens is your hypothalamus is trying to reset your body temperature. And so maybe it's setting it to 101. So the body has to generate more heat. And one of the ways we generate heat is we shiver. And so you're actually going to think you're too cold. Even though you're at normal, your body's like, no, you need to be 101. So you're going to generate heat. And often if you're getting a fever, you start to feel really cold and you might start to shiver. So the purpose of a fever, as I said, it is helpful. It does help boost the immune system. But we also know if it gets too high, it has some detrimental effects. So particularly we worry about dehydration, and it can put a lot of burden, on your heart, on your lungs, especially if you have someone who already has some issues in those areas. So if you have a high fever and you're trying to treat it, you can take what's called an antipyretic. And that's what I showed you earlier. All that fancy word means is that it's something that reduces a fever. And you might want to do this because, again, too high of a fever could be detrimental. So this wraps up the lecture talking about the innate defenses. And you got one more left where I'll talk about the adaptive.